Welcome back into the Daily Dose. I'm your host, Jeff Hansen. As always, show's brought to you by Give'emHellBrigham.com and by CougarSportsInsider.com, part of the 24/7 Sports Network. Before we get started, take a chance. Please just subscribe to the channel. Please like this video, share this video, and help us grow this platform. We've got some crazy, awesome things planned for how we cover the Cougars this upcoming football season. And we'll be transparent. We're using the offseason to try some things out. We're using the offseason to build our brand and to build our platform. There's going to be some beta testing. There's going to be some trial and error. That's what the offseason's for. But come August, come September, when football kicks off, there's not going to be a better place on YouTube to follow BYU football. You are going to want to be here. So please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a second of the action that we have planned today. Delving further into, I guess, the rebuttal to the anonymous Big 12 assistant coach who claimed in Athlon Sports that BYU won't be able to get a different type of recruit simply because they're in the Big 12 conference. I think that's BS. I think that's an assistant coach who's probably a graduate assistant who has no idea the type of player that BYU does or does not get, and just made a comment to make a comment. I think BYU is already proving that they can get different types of players, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to go into some of the examples out of the transfer portal that BYU has signed in the last, 4 or 5 months since the first transfer portal in December was opened. We're going to talk about some of those guys that BYU has and really kind of prove this statement to just be nonsense, because it is. It's nonsense. So let's go all the way back to BYU's first recruit that they landed out of the transfer portal during this cycle. That's UNLV transfer Aiden Robbins. And this is a really good example to prove that the Big 12 is making a difference. And here's why. BYU tried to get Aiden Robbins without the Big 12. When he was coming out of high school, he took a late official visit to BYU, and things went really, really well. The Robbins family, Aiden himself, they were incredibly impressed by Provo and everything that Provo had to offer. But ultimately, it wasn't enough. It wasn't the Power 5 level. It wasn't the biggest stage of college football. So Aiden Robbins signed with Louisville. It wasn't until this go-round, after he had a checkpoint, a rest stop at UNLV, that he re-entered the transfer portal, and then BYU could check all of the boxes of what he was really looking for. When he came out of UNLV, he had a number of schools that were off after him this time, but now BYU was able to capitalize on a guy like Robbins, who was comfortable going into a different environment, a unique environment for him, a unique BYU atmosphere. He was comfortable with that, and BYU checked just enough boxes. So the Big 12 absolutely helped BYU get Aiden Robbins. You go to guys like Jackson Cravens and Isaiah Bagna, who were also committed to BYU out of the transfer portal. Those are players that BYU could have got as an independent football program. Cravens obviously played at Timpview High School in Provo, so that's a local kid, tons of ties to the program. That is a guy that BYU, it's always been in their wheelhouse. Isaiah Bagna, now maybe he himself wouldn't come to BYU without the Big 12. I don't know. But players like Isaiah Bagna, in terms of his size, his skill set, his offer list, what he brings to the table on the field, those types of players have been there. I don't think that Bagna is a great example of BYU leveling up as a member of the Big 12 conference, because I think BYU's been able to get Isaiah Bagnas in the past. Keaton Slovis, that's an interesting one. BYU has had success with quarterbacks for decades, and particularly over the last 5 or 6 years with Zach Wilson and Jaron Hall, and even Baylor Romney to a lesser extent. BYU's had success with quarterbacks, but if you go throughout BYU's quarterback history, it's almost always a quarterback with local ties to the program, dating all the way back to Jim McMahon in the 80s, that he was from Roy High School and played at the school 50 miles to the south at BYU, or it's been a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's not very often, it's not impossible, but it's not very often that BYU has been able to land a high-profile guy who's not a member of the church and bring them into the BYU quarterback room. Keaton Slovis is a different fit for BYU. I mean, you have to go back to like Steve Sarkisian coming to BYU out of junior college, but even that, he wasn't quite the high-profile guy, didn't have the name recognition coming in that Keaton Slovis has. So I think that's another example of the Big 12 being a little bit different for BYU. The next transfers who committed, Waylon Lapuahu, yeah, that's a BYU guy. Paul Maile, yeah, that's a BYU guy. Eddie Heckard, we talked about on yesterday's show. Eddie Heckard, he's an FCS cornerback. He's coming from Weber State. But when he hit the transfer portal, he had Pac-12 schools, he had Big 12 schools, he had a number of Power 5 options. And if it wasn't for Jay Hill and his relationship with his former head coach, now defensive coordinator at BYU, and that BYU could also check that Power 5 box, Eddie Heckard is not at BYU. In fact, Heckard declared for the NFL draft when he entered the transfer portal. And the feedback that he got from NFL scouts was, hey, we like what you bring to the table. You've got to do it at the Power 5 level. So very specifically, Eddie Heckard was looking for Power 5 competition. If BYU doesn't check that box, BYU does not get Eddie Heckard's services. Moving down the list, AJ Vongphachanh out of Utah State. Look, BYU had to beat out schools like South Carolina and Washington State, Minnesota, who were in his Final Four to get AJ to come from Utah State to BYU. Is AJ Vongphachanh like this crazy high-profile 5-star linebacker that Alabama's competing for? No, but he's a guy who had a number of Power 5 options out of Utah State that isn't coming to BYU last year. He's got 1 year left to make a statement for the NFL. He wanted the Power 5 level to do that. If BYU's not in the Big 12 conference, AJ Vongphachanh is not coming from Utah State. He's got other options to hit that checkbox and find the Power 5 stage somewhere else. Moving down the list, Caleb Etienne. That happened quickly. There is no chance that a 13-game starter at a Power 5 school hits the transfer portal and signs with BYU in 3 or 4 days who has no previous ties to the program. Braden Kersley is a GA at BYU. He was a GA at Oklahoma State last year. There's not very many recruits transferring and uprooting their family because of a relationship with a GA. So, come on. He really didn't have a relationship with BYU. That's not happening if they're not in a Power 5 conference. It's just not. Caleb Etienne is not a member of the church. Caleb Etienne is not from Utah or anywhere in the West area. He doesn't have that local tie to the program, and he is an absolute stud at left tackle who could have gone to a number of different schools and been a big boost to a number of offensive lines. Without the Big 12, BYU is not getting Caleb Etienne. Now we move into some of the recent commitments that have come in over the last few weeks. Jake Eichhorn, yeah, that's a BYU guy out of Weber State, originally from Beaver, Utah. That's a BYU guy. Darius Lassiter and Keelan Marion. I want to talk about those two wide receivers. They're not the highest profile wide receiver, but I don't know that they're coming to BYU if BYU's not on a big stage. They both had options to play elsewhere. They both are guys that remind me of a former BYU wide receiver, Micah Simon. But Micah Simon came to BYU as a lowly recruited 2-star out of Texas who didn't have any options that were on a big stage. BYU was his biggest offer, without a doubt. Lassiter and Marion, they had other options. They could have gone to a number of different places. They're arguably bigger or smaller than BYU. But these are two guys that aren't LDS, don't have any ties to the program, and they came to BYU to play at a Power 5 level. I think that's evidence of getting two wide receivers that BYU doesn't get outside of their Big 12 membership. And then finally, Deion Smith. Yeah, of course. He was the leading rusher at a Power 5 school. I get it was Colorado, but BYU is not adding the leading rusher of a Power 5 school to probably be a backup running back without being part of the Big 12 conference. So if we go through BYU's transfer class, I get it. It's kind of a boring rundown of who's in the class. But if we go through that class, I think it's clear that about half of those guys are not coming to BYU if BYU is not in the Big 12 conference. I think we've already proven BYU is getting a different type of athlete. And I think BYU will continue to prove over the coming weeks and coming recruiting classes that they can get different athletes. Thanks again for subscribing to the show. Till next time, give them hell.